Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara, who is suffering with allergies again. Somebody give me something that will tell me about relief.
But the weather's warm.
The weather is warm.
The weather's warm.
I love the weather. I was mowing grass yesterday, and that's why I'm like this.
Yep, I
love
know.
The weather.
But it is beautiful. Very beautiful out.
It is gorgeous.
We thank you again to our patrons who support this podcast and make it possible. We can never thank you enough. So thank you.
We love you. We appreciate you. We appreciate your support of us, both financially and your support by simply sharing the podcast and listening to it. We appreciate that so
Absolutely.
much. Yes.
So this episode, should we ever have sympathy for child abusers? I think as Christians, this is an especially important topic.
It is.
Because I get asked that question a good bit. At what point do we minister to them? And it's automatically assumed that we minister to abusers. And you guys know me well enough to know that I take a different stance. I don't begin with the premise that we must minister to abusers. We've spoken a lot about the difference between sheep and wolves. Again, I think those descriptions in the Bible are not describing behavior. It's not describing what they do, but who they are.
It's describing the heart of the person.
Right.
And I think that's so important when talking about this particular topic.
Yeah. So, that question I think is really important because what inevitably happens is that abusers will, they'll come out of prison or if they haven't been incarcerated, they'll land on your doorstep anyway. They'll give some kind of a sob story typically. And it sounds really convincing. And if you don't check the facts, you really will buy their story hook, line, and sinker. They're very convincing. But then your heartstrings start to get pulled and you begin to feel sorry for them. And then you start to question, okay, my Christianity requires me to forgive people and to listen to repentant people and to give them a place at the table. By
nature, there are a lot of us like myself. I am an empath. And
that's where I get it from.
Oh, you do. Yes, you do. And my nature says I should feel sorry for somebody.
Yeah.
Especially if they come with this heart that says, I'm so sorry and please forgive me. I'll never do this again. It makes it really difficult on those of us who have been taught either within the church or that's part of our nature to forgive automatically.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult, except, and I like, Jimmy, that you interjected that we need to look at the facts. And that's where things change.
And that's really hard for empaths to do because we're very emotion-driven.
Yes.
We're the kind of personality, if we see somebody tearing up, we start tearing up. It's kind of like that, the old thing, if somebody yawns, everybody in the room, it starts this chain reaction. Well, empaths are very much that way. So if we see people smiling, we start to smile.
Right.
It's just kind of a visceral response. If we see people tearing up, it starts making us emotional. We react and respond to emotion.
Well, we feel the other person's feeling.
That's exactly right.
And it makes this particular subject really difficult.
It does.
Very much so.
I wanted to begin with an analogy because this is fresh in the news. It's national news. But there was a car accident down in Florida, a DUI manslaughter for the second time. I think she's 24 years old, 24-year-old by the name of Jennifer Carvajal, I think is how you pronounce it. In 2014, she got a DUI at the age of 16 or 17, depending on different news stories have different ages. But she was either 16 or 17 years old, 2014, and she got behind the wheel, completely drunk, T-boned somebody at an intersection and killed the guy. So just a few days ago, she was clocked by a police officer going in the opposite direction at 111. So he pulled into the median, clocked her again. As she passed by the cruiser, she still was going 111, which indicates she probably didn't see him. Mm-hmm. So he pulls behind her, starts a chase, trying to get her to pull over. He gets behind her, and because his lights and sirens are on, I've watched a video, his lights and sirens are on. There was a car that pulled off onto the shoulder, which is where she was driving, and she just made a real hard rate veer, went into a ditch, went airborne, landed on top of some cars inside a car dealership. One of her passengers was ejected. That man died as soon as he got to the hospital. A 19-year-old was launched into the back seat, and then another passenger was ejected. And both of her passengers are in critical condition. She was the only one in the car wearing a seatbelt, didn't get a scratch. And so she's facing a second manslaughter charge. So, my questions are these. If she pleads with people and says that she's sorry, does that take away from her patterned DUI manslaughters or her responsibility? I think most of us get really upset when we see DUIs, and especially DUI manslaughters, and especially repeated DUI manslaughters. It's infuriating.
I have zero tolerance. I'll be honest.
And we
with
shouldn't.
You. I have zero tolerance. On my website, Silent Grief, I have thousands of parents who have lost children because of drunk drivers.
Sure.
It is devastating.
Yeah.
And there is no return from this pain. Mm-mm. It's not like, oh boy, I did something bad. I'm going to go to the parent. I'm going to say, I'm so sorry. And life goes on. Mm-hmm. Not so. Yeah. Life has been disrupted, torn inside out, upside down. A life has been taken away, an innocent life, while the person behind the wheel is responsible. When we get behind the wheel of that vehicle, we have a responsibility. Yeah. And when you take that first drink, I am of the belief that you are to stay put then. When you take that second drink, you're not drunk yet, and I've watched people do this, and it infuriates me, where they will just drink, and you have to fight them to get their keys. Mm-hmm. This is a repeat here. A repeat where a life was already taken.
And clearly that didn't wake her up.
No.
That didn't. If taking a life, taking an innocent life, and living through hearing the spouse of, I guess she was the fiance of this man who died back in 2014, she pleaded and begged and had to get a victim advocate to work with her because the trauma was so severe. If seeing somebody who's a beloved family member of the person whose life you took, seeing their lives completely shattered in front of you in the courtroom, if that doesn't move you to stop, nothing will.
No, nothing will. Nothing will.
So,
nothing.
A question about DUIs, while we're on that subject. What would repentance look like for Jennifer? Would it include her never driving again? And I know that sounds crazy. I know that sounds ridiculous, but quite honestly, we have somebody in my own congregation who had a very similar situation years and years and years ago, has never driven again.
I will tell you this.
And never will drive again.
I will share with our listeners and viewers, my mother was an alcoholic. I rode in the car as a child with my mother many times when she was drunk, and I can remember clutching the side of the door, begging her to stop. She would speed. She would go just full speed. And one of the last times that she drove was she hit straight head on into a telephone pole. Totally demolished, smashed the car. She was fine. She was fine. She walked away from it okay. But it was shortly after, and this is where I have to respect my mother for the decision she made. She knew she was not going to stop drinking. She knew. She said, I'm not going to stop drinking. She, for whatever reason, liked drinking. But she took her license and she mailed them in and asking that they never give her license back.
Yeah.
And she never drove a day from the age of, I think she was 52 actually, when she handed her license in. That says she knew.
That's responsibility.
Right.
You know,
and I have always respected her for that.
We're talking about repentance, but somebody who doesn't put the bottle down, but puts the car keys away forever. Right. That's, I know it sounds strange to say it, but that's a deep sense of responsibility to say, I will not.
I have respected, yes.
Yeah, I won't put the lives of people at risk because I know when I pick up a bottle, I will not stop.
No, she knew.
And I know if I pick up the keys, I will drive drunk.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, it's just that self-knowledge to know and have that awareness that that you're not responsible enough to carry the burden of having car keys.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So, what else would repentance look like for the DUI manslaughter person? Never having passengers again. Suppose somebody drives, would they never have passengers again? My opinion is they're still going out, and there's still plenty of other people out on the road that you could kill.
I really think relinquishing their license forever.
Permanently.
If they know they're going to continue to drink. And actually, any person with a pattern of drinking will tell you at any given moment, they're walking a line.
Yeah.
Or
do it for a decade.
Well, yeah.
Prove that you can be responsible and not drink.
Yeah.
Would the repentant DUI manslaughter pay for therapy for families of victims?
I think it should.
I do too.
Absolutely.
Should Jennifer ask for the harshest sentence that the judge can hand down to her? I would think a repentant person wouldn't do the opposite and try to plea and bargain and get lighter charges. They would say, I can never look in the mirror again the rest of my life, knowing that I did what I did. Twice now, I took the lives of innocent people. Hand me the heaviest sentence. Right. Would they never go near a bar again? I think that's obviously a rhetorical question, but clearly going near bars and parties doesn't work well for Jennifer.
I would think alcohol would sicken a person if you've taken a life by alcohol.
It should.
I would think you would never want to hear the word, let alone look it or ingest it. I think you would say, I never again will I get near it. I can't control myself with it.
Right. Would they demand mandatory rehabilitation? That's something that came up in a couple of the articles about this Jennifer Carvajal. People or family members of victims were saying, why is there not mandatory rehabilitation for people who have DUI charges, let alone DUI manslaughter?
Yes, right.
Why is there not mandatory rehabilitation? Instead, you know what she got? She got probation. She didn't even get prison for the first one.
I just get sick.
I know.
I do.
I know. It makes no sense. So, while we're talking about that analogy, I mean, that upsets us. That makes us angry. I don't know of any church, although I'm sure they're out there, who would hand the keys to somebody who has DUI manslaughter charges and say, "Hey, we're gonna have you drive our church bus around."
I was going to say, drive a busload of kids, pick them up for VBS.
But I say that,
yeah.
but I'm sure they're out there.
I pray not.
Surprisingly.
I pray not, but you're probably right.
But making the transition from that analogy, what about churches? Because I would argue that churches most definitely have sympathy for child rapists, and they protect them with very little to no accountability. Why don't you talk about this survey by Christianity Today International?
Okay, Jimmy was wonderful enough to dig up some facts, real life facts and data for us. There was a 210 survey in 2010 by Christianity Today, I don't even know if I can talk, Jimmy, of 3,000 church leaders and members. There's some shocking but not shocking data that was gotten from this. 20% of the leaders knew of registered sex offenders attending. Now, we know, we've had podcast after podcast where we know church leaders are aware that there are sex offenders in the congregation.
Or they remain intentionally unaware.
Absolutely.
They don't want to know.
Okay, right.
Which I think 20%.
That's a low.
I think that's
number.
a very low number
I do too.
because I've not visited a church yet. In 10 years of doing advocacy work, I've not visited a church yet where there's not an awareness of
I think that's a very low
church.
ball number. But anyway, that's the number they got. Then this is interesting. 80% of the respondents agreed. Now listen to this. Sex offenders who legally have paid their dues should be welcomed into the church. Okay, we've had many podcasts about this, about the dangers of doing this very thing. Of just saying, you know what, you went to prison, you served your time, come on, come into the fold, we welcome you. God
and it's our duty
you.
to welcome you.
Oh, yes. God forgave you, and so do we. So, end of discussion.
Yep.
And the third one, virtually none of these will ever have accountability beyond secret agreements between the leaders and the offenders.
Yep.
And I at first I said to Jimmy, I find this appalling, but I don't. We know this happens. You've worked with how many churches who have done this very thing, who have said, no, we have it taken care of.
Well, I've had churches send me these covenant agreements. They call them covenant agreements, or that's typically the name that they call them. But I've had churches send them to me and say, what do you mean we don't have accountability?
Yeah,
we have this wonderful agreement. And I read it, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I have a whole collection of these covenant agreements that leaders have given me because they don't see anything wrong with them. And I don't think that leaders in their own minds are thinking, we really want kids to be unsafe here. That's not what they're thinking. What they're thinking is, my goodness, we're being responsible.
They think
we're
they're
holding
being
them
responsible,
accountable,
and we're being Christ-like because we're forgiving. We are forgiving the sinner. And keep in mind, when we're talking about this survey, this is not about people who have been maybe convicted. They have been convicted.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Of the most vile of offenses, of sexual abuse on a child.
Yeah.
An underage person.
I mean, that's a great point.
Yes.
This is not hearsay. It's not allegations. These are people who are registered.
I think you did this, but
they're registered sex
they
offenders.
have paid their dues. They went to prison. They did whatever they were supposed to do, and now they're out. And now it's back to church, back to the playground.
Yeah.
And some might not like me calling it that, but let's face it, church is a playground for sex offenders.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's interesting too, in all of these policies, at least everyone that I've ever read, they have some kind of a clause in there that says, you are not, sex offenders are not permitted to go into the children's wing. Now listen, where there are children. And I thought, I mean, if you stop and think about this for a minute, okay, there are children in the children's wing, You know where else there are children?
Yeah, in the General Assembly.
Everywhere. All through the building.
Absolutely, all over the place.
So
yes.
it's insane to me because the risk increases dramatically for abuse to happen where there's less structure for the kids. It would be safer to say, sex offenders, you're allowed in the children's wing and nowhere else. Right. It would actually be safer for the kids because in the children's wing, there's structure. The kids are in classes. Right. They're behind locked doors. Yes. They have 2 adults in every classroom. Yes. That sex offender is not going to get inside of those classrooms. They'll be able to be in the halls, and that's about it. They're not going to have access to the kids.
That's a great point, Jimmy. That is a great point.
But when they're in the General Assembly, there's no structure. Everybody's guard is down. People are distracted. It's that whole spotlight of attention thing.
And some people might be saying, well, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, lots and lots.
We have had podcast after podcast about abuse in plain sight.
Yeah, that's right.
It happens.
Yeah.
And that's a thrill for the abuser.
100%.
Yes.
So I'm going to read a couple. These are actually direct quotes from policies that I pulled. Seventh-day Adventists, they have a policy. Now, this is not like, I don't think this is a policy for the whole denomination. Mm-hmm. I think this is just
I wondered about
one church's sample policy, but I think that can be replicated. You know, Sarah McDougall, she's Seventh-day Adventist and posts a lot of stuff about their policies.
Absolutely.
But here's what it says. This is a direct quote that I pulled from this policy that's public. I just did a Google search and up it came. Quote, notification of convicted sex offenders attending church A. Fill in the blank. Here we go. As long as there is a well-established church attendance policy for convicted sex offenders and the local church board as well as church elders and deacons have been made aware of that a convicted sex offender is attending church, and the church has complied with all the requirements set forth in this policy, wait for this, there is no need to notify the church membership.
Like I said, I wasn't shocked.
No need to notify the church. This, to me, is worse. It's worse than having a volunteer to drive the church bus who has multiple DUI manslaughter charges and not informing the parents of those kids who are getting into that bus that their driver of the bus has multiple DUI manslaughter charges. This is
that
actually
gives me
worse.
Chills. It really to think of how abhorrent this is. It really
it's insanity.
Is awful. It is terrible. Yes, it is.
Well, how about Brotherhood Mutual, the second largest insurance provider for churches? This is a direct quote. I pulled this right off of their website. Their policy on sex offenders, registered sex offenders, convicted serial child rapists. Here's their policy. Churches can decide which church members need to know that a person has a history of sex offenses. Okay.
So we pick
cool.
and we choose.
Yeah, you can. It's optional. You can, if you want to let church members. By the way, what do you think your average church leader is going to opt to do if given the choice? Are they going to inform their entire congregation and rock a boat?
No.
Or are they going to have this secret covenant agreement?
And, yes, agree
where,
that as long as you be a good boy and you abide by our policy, we will not have to stir up trouble within the congregants.
Yeah, of course they're going to pick that if given the option.
I really love your analogy of the person with the DUI. I truly love it. If this was the policy and we have a person who was hired at a church or at a school rather, and or wants to be a volunteer, wanted to drive, the school bus
Right.
for children to go to games
Mm-hmm.
or after school activities. And the Board of Education decided, okay, you know what?
Parents are on a need-to-know basis, and they don't need to know.
Yeah. She already served time in jail. She served like 6 months. She paid all her fines. She attended all her DUI classes. Why rock the boat and tell the parents about this? After all, we need her help, and she's part of our community. Let's let her do it.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, it makes no sense.
It makes zero sense, Jimmy.
And
Zero.
I want to talk about the weakness in that analogy, though, because there is a weakness, and I think it's at least for me, it's glaringly obvious, but for some people, maybe not as much. But, okay, DUIs, we're talking about somebody who habitually gets drunk or high and irresponsibly and intentionally gets behind the wheel.
Right.
The intentionality is getting behind the wheel, not necessarily with the drinking, though. I mean, it is intentional, but they're not thinking in their mind, I'm going to create victims today.
No, they're not planning.
I don't think somebody who's an addict, I don't think that that's on their mind, that today I'm going to produce a victim and kill somebody behind the wheel.
Yeah.
Whereas a child sexual predator is thinking exactly that.
All the time.
They're thinking,
all the time.
I know who my victim is. I know how I'm going to get access to my victim. I know what I'm going to do to my victim, when I'm going to do it, how I'm going to do that, how I'm going to accomplish that, how I'm going to keep it a secret, how I'm going to keep the parents blind. They have it all planned out. Every step of the way, they have always intended on producing a victim.
Now, we will still have the person who says, okay, but they paid their time. They paid their time. They got out, because we're talking about convicted sexual abusers here. Shouldn't we be sympathetic and welcome them? And the answer to me is blaring, and neon sign blaring. No.
No, because they willfully, intentionally, and serially humiliated, raped, and stripped away the innocence of child after child after child after child.
And we have data that says once an offender, what?
Yeah.
Always
an offender. There is
always an offender.
There is no healing for them.
No.
There is no cure for them. And that's coming from the secular world,
right.
That, people who work with sex offenders. Anna Salter says it.
There is book after book that comes through and says victim after victim has been produced, and the person can be convicted, be put in prison, come out, and what do? Go do it again, only this time smarter.
Right.
This time smarter.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to keep an eye on the time, because we could go on forever. I'll mention briefly, this is from a blog post that I did a couple years ago, talking about Summit Church in North Carolina, J.D. Greer's church, from the very top. This is a direct quote from their policy. This is talking about sex offenders, registered sex offenders. You can attend services. This is not a typo. You can, C-A-N, you can attend services where children are present, such as worship services, provided that one of your shepherding individuals is present. We're asking families, that is, not of the offender, we're asking the general population of this church. Woo! Transformer just blew.
Wondered what that was.
Our lights flickered and we heard it sounded like a bomb. It was a transformer.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll keep going. Hope it wasn't right outside the house.
I hope not.
We're asking families to sacrifice peace of mind that would be present if we did not allow anyone under registered sex offender status to attend. In other words, we're asking you to sacrifice your peace of mind that you would get if we didn't let registered sex offenders attend church here. We're asking you to sacrifice that peace of mind, and we're going to bring them in anyway. In other words, it's a big screw you to all the families. I mean, that's the only way I can view this.
It is. It is.
So, you know, in short, churches should not have sympathy on abusers who chose to serially abuse and harm children.
And I hope people, that this is driven home to you, this idea that this wasn't an accident that we're talking about. Child sex abuse is not an accident. It's not an oopsie. It's a very planned out, well thought out criminal act that has consequences that are so severe that many are left for the rest of their days on this earth suffering.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about just a little scratch.
Oops. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oops. Yeah.
Sorry. I put a dent in your car. I'm sorry. I'll fix it.
Right.
Doesn't work.
Yeah, there is no fixing this.
No.
Which leads to these points. You know, the damages have long-term, often lifelong effects on the victims. Number 2, most abusers will comply with these agreements in order to violate more children. That's the whole purpose of compliance. Number 3, there needs to be accountability between churches and offenders, not sympathy. Sympathy should not be our first response. Accountability should.
Right. Absolutely.
And accountability.
1,000%.
Yeah, and accountability says to Jennifer, it would say, you're no longer going to come anywhere within breathing distance of a vehicle ever again.
Right.
For the offender, I think we should unapologetically say, you're not going to come within eyesight of any minor child ever again.
There are so many online
as long as I can
services,
help
Jimmy.
it.
If this person truly wants to worship God, there are online services that
Absolutely.
you can participate in. You
Absolutely.
do not have to be in a group with children
Right.
to worship
That's right.
God.
That's exactly right.
Yes.
And you can have adult social
services.
interactions.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can go to adult groups.
Right.
You can go to small groups. You can serve
Absolutely,
in
yes.
different capacities.
Right.
If you're truly repentant, you would seek out those opportunities.
You would say, I will not put myself in that position.
Right.
Just as my mother handed her license in and said, I can't do it. I'm not going to get on the road again behind the wheel.
Yep.
An offender here should say, not going to do it.
Ever.
I will not put myself in the front of a small child.
Yeah.
I can't do it. I will not do it.
Because I cannot be trusted.
Because I can't be trusted.
I've proved that
right.
I can't be
Yes,
trusted.
Absolutely.
So, you know, and then the 4th point, misplaced sympathy tells victims that they don't matter as much as the person who stole their innocence. So, with that said, I think you know where we stand.
I think that's clear.
Should be pretty clear.
Yeah.
Mother, would you like to leave our listeners with a truth bomb?
I would love to do that. Be 100% certain who receives your support. A wolf is always a wolf. The purpose of the wolf is to devour the sheep. Let's be protectors of the sheep.
I will amen that. Thank you all for tuning into this episode, and we will catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron. And check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.